It began, as such things often do, with something quite unremarkable. The evening bells of St. Jude's rang out over St. Mary Mead, calm and orderly, marking the hour of 8. By midnight, they would toll again, 3 soft, deliberate chimes that most would sleep through. But that night, as the first bell struck, a scream rose from the direction of the old vicarage lane, slicing through the stillness like a tear through fine lace. Mrs. Bantry, who had been dozing beside her husband's chessboard, sat upright. 2 streets over, Mr. Clement paused his reading. Even the grocer's boy, returning from a late errand, stopped beneath the gaslight, uncertain if what he'd heard was human. But by morning, there was no uncertainty left. Colonel Geoffrey Harborough, lately retired and much respected, was found dead on the lawn of his cottage, a wound to the head and an overturned lantern beside him. By breakfast, the news had already made its way through the village faster than the post. The vicar's wife heard it from her maid, who heard it from the milkman, who'd heard it from the constable's cousin. The entire village was alive with chatter. How terrible, how sudden, how odd, given that the colonel was the sort of man who'd always prided himself on being early to bed and sober as a judge. At the window of her neat little house on the High Street, Miss Marple stood watering her geraniums, her soft eyes half-lidded, her expression unreadable. She had known the colonel, of course. Everyone had. A stiff man, fond of routine and reluctant conversation, but courteous enough to those he deemed respectable. He had been widowed 6 years, and though there had been whisperings about a lady friend in the next parish, nothing had ever come of it. Nothing ever seemed to, with the colonel. She set her watering can down gently and turned as a shadow crossed her garden gate. It was Inspector Slack, hat askew, a frown already carved into his face. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said, trying for politeness. "I suppose you've heard." "About poor Colonel Harborough? Yes, indeed. Tragic, so sudden." He sighed. "Looks like robbery. Door was open, papers strewn about. Probably surprised the fellow." Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the rose bush that separated her garden from the lane. "Oh, I shouldn't think so," she murmured. The colonel wasn't one for surprises. He was very careful about locks and people. The inspector looked puzzled, but Miss Marple's attention had already wandered to the faint sound of the church bells, carried on the wind. 3 soft tolls. She counted them almost unconsciously. Then, with a faint smile, she looked back at Slack. "Do let me know," she said mildly, "if you happen to find a broken watch among his things." And with that, she returned to her flowers, as if the matter were no more urgent than the weather. But beneath that calm exterior, her mind had already begun to trace its quiet, inexorable path through human motives, petty cruelties, and the small inconsistencies that others would never think to notice. The bells of St. Jude's had tolled 3 times before midnight, and somewhere in that chime, Miss Marple was certain, lay the truth of Colonel Harborough's death. By the afternoon, the air in St. Mary Mead was heavy with talk. The grocer's queue hummed with speculation. The postmistress leaned forward to whisper, and at the Blue Boar, 2 gentlemen argued whether the colonel had been struck down by a vagrant or by Providence itself. Only Miss Marple, sitting by her parlor window with her embroidery, seemed unaffected by the general excitement. Her needle moved with calm precision, though her thoughts were far from idle. Colonel Harborough's death was not, in her estimation, the work of chance. She had lived long enough to know that death in villages rarely was. Violence of this sort tended to come from inside one's own garden hedge, not from beyond it. And so, when young Constable Reeves came by with a polite knock and a hopeful gleam in his eyes, so Miss Marple was ready with tea, cake, and the sort of patient attention that encouraged conversation. "They say he was struck from behind," Reeves said, lowering his voice as though the colonel might still be listening. "Lantern shattered beside him, no sign of struggle in the house. But something's queer about it. The study window was open, and a chair knocked over, yet not a thing stolen. "Ah," Miss Marple murmured. "How odd. People often do the strangest things when they wish to appear to have been robbed, don't they?" Reeves blinked. "You mean—" She smiled faintly. "Oh, nothing at all. I dare say the inspector has it all in hand." In fact, Inspector Slack was at that moment conducting his own brand of inquiry. Brisk, loud, and rather fond of declaring each new discovery a breakthrough. The Colonel's maid, Elsie Pratt, was in tears. The gardener, Mr. Kellett, red-faced with indignation, and the neighbour, Mrs. Harbottle, offended that no one had yet thought to ask her opinion. Slack listened to them all with gruff impatience before concluding that the most likely culprit was the itinerant who had been seen 2 nights earlier near the railway line. "He'll have wanted money," Slack muttered. "Harborough surprised him, got himself done in for his trouble. Simple as that." Miss Marple happened to arrive at the vicarage just as this confident declaration was being repeated to Mrs. Bantry, who was relaying it with breathless satisfaction. "You see, my dear," Mrs. Bantry said, "it's really quite straightforward. Terrible thing, but there's no mystery to it." Miss Marple's eyes, however, drifted past her friend's teacup to the church tower visible through the window. The 3 bells gleamed faintly in the sunlight, silent now, but still heavy with meaning. "Oh, I wouldn't be too sure," she said softly. "If it were a robbery, why leave his watch? A thief seldom overlooks time." Mrs. Bantry blinked, half startled, half delighted by the implication. "You don't think—" "I think," Miss Marple said, "that the Colonel was a man who liked things to be precise, his garden trimmed, his boots polished, his letters tied with string. It would take a very particular sort of accident to unmake such order in so violent a fashion." That evening, the village quieted as the autumn mist crept low along the hedges. At the Colonel's cottage, lanterns flickered as officers moved between rooms. In the study, papers lay scattered across the desk. Old correspondence, army records, and a half-written letter that began, "To whom it may concern," but went no further. Inspector Slack frowned at it. "Incomplete," he said. "Could have been interrupted." Miss Marple, who had been invited to look round under the polite pretext of offering tea to the constables, stood near the door, her gaze resting on the mantel. "How curious," she murmured. "That clock has stopped at 10 minutes to 12. Slack grunted. "Knocked over in the scuffle." "Perhaps," she said gently, "though I fancy it would take rather more than a scuffle to dislodge a clock so solidly placed, and yet it stopped before the bells. Before midnight, you see." Slack opened his mouth to reply, but she had already turned to the window. The grass outside was flattened in 2 distinct patches, leading from the gate toward the house, as though 2 people had met there, not one. "Do you suppose," she said thoughtfully, "that the Colonel might have been expecting a visitor?" By the next morning, the vicar's wife confirmed it. A letter had been found in the outgoing post, a short, formal note addressed to a Miss Lydia Harcourt of Lower Cavenham, inviting her to discuss a matter of private importance that very night. Miss Marple read it once, then again, her lips tightening slightly. Lydia Harcourt. The name is familiar. A cousin of Mrs. Bartlett's, wasn't she? Rather unfortunate business about an inheritance years ago. I remember it caused a little embarrassment. Inspector Slack snorted. "Embarrassment doesn't kill a man." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "But resentment often does." That afternoon, she took her customary walk toward the churchyard, pausing where the lane curved past the Colonel's cottage. The mist had lifted, leaving a faint scent of smoke and damp grass. Near the gatepost, something glinted, a small brass button, polished smooth. She stooped, examined it, and tucked it quietly into her glove. She did not mention it to anyone, not even when Mrs. Bantry caught up with her and chattered eagerly about the new suspect. "They've gone to fetch this Miss Harcourt," Mrs. Bantry whispered. Apparently, she came by motor car just before 11 last night. What do you make of that?" Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes distant. "I should like," she said, "to hear what she was wearing." For a moment they walked in silence, the bells of St. Jude's beginning to toll the quarter hour. Their sound hung softly in the air, patient, deliberate, inevitable. And in that quiet rhythm, Miss Marple thought she could almost hear it again, the faint echo of footsteps on grass, the murmured voices before the scream, and the single, small chime of a watch stopping forever at 10 minutes to 12. By the time they reached the gate, she knew that the Colonel's death had not been the work of chance at all, but of something far more personal. And as the third bell faded into silence, she decided quite calmly to pay a visit to Miss Lydia Harcourt herself. The following day dawned grey and cool, with a fine drizzle that seemed to hush the world into secrecy. Miss Marple, wrapped in a shawl of soft wool, made her way to Lower Kevenham. It was not far, 2 miles along the hedge-lined road, but long enough for thought. She knew of Miss Lydia Harcourt by reputation, a woman of a certain age who had once been the Colonel's fiancée, or nearly so, before a sudden quarrel ended the matter. People had spoken then of pride, of money, of the stubbornness that lives in old families like ivy on stone. It was, Miss Marple reflected, the sort of bitterness that never quite dies, only hides itself under the politeness of years. Lower Kevenham was a smaller, lonelier place than St. Mary Mead, its cottages tucked between damp fields and crooked apple trees. Miss Harcourt lived in a neat, narrow house beside the old forge. When she opened the door, her expression faltered for half a second before recovering into courtesy. She was tall, finely dressed, and wore her grief, or perhaps her anger, like a veil she refused to lift. "Miss Marple?" "From St. Mary Mead, is it not?" "Yes, I've heard of you," she said, stepping aside. "You must forgive the state of the place. I've not had the heart for much since yesterday's news." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Quite understandable, my dear. The Colonel's passing has shocked us all. I came, if I may say so, to offer my condolences, and perhaps to spare you a visit from Inspector Slack, who is a well-meaning but rather forceful man." Lydia's eyes flickered. "He has already been quite insistent that I tell him where I was between 10 and 12 last night." She folded her arms tightly. "I told him the truth. I arrived at St. Mary Mead just after 11. Geoffrey had asked me to call. He said it was urgent." Miss Marple nodded as if she had expected no less. "Yes, he was always a man who disliked postponement." Lydia hesitated, then said quietly, "But when I reached the cottage, the lights were out. I knocked, twice, no answer. I thought perhaps he'd fallen asleep, so I went home. It was too late to disturb anyone. I never imagined—" Her voice broke off. Miss Marple placed a gloved hand lightly on her arm. "Of course not, my dear. But you did see no one on the road? No movement near the gate?" "Nothing but fog," Lydia replied, "thick as milk. Though I thought I heard something, a sound like footsteps running off into the wood." She gave a faint, uneasy laugh. "But perhaps that was only my imagination. I was dreadfully nervous." "Quite natural," Miss Marple said softly. "Grief and memory play strange tricks together. And what were you wearing, if I might ask? Forgive an old woman's curiosity." Lydia blinked. "A dark traveling coat, brown gloves. My hat was felt, green with a small feather. I drove my own car. Why?" "No reason in particular," Miss Marple said with a small smile. "Only that a brass button was found near the gate. It may belong to no one of importance, but one never knows." The faintest shadow crossed Lydia's face. "A button? From a coat?" "Yes," Miss Marple said mildly. "A large one. Military, I think, not the sort ladies wear." For a moment, silence. Then Lydia murmured, "Perhaps Geoffrey still had old uniforms about. He was sentimental about his regiment." Miss Marple inclined her head. Yes, indeed. Sentimental and orderly. He would not have left a button lying in the grass, but perhaps it was dropped by someone else who visited him that night. Lydia's lips tightened. I told you, I saw no one. Of course, Miss Marple said kindly, rising to leave. And I quite believe you. It's often what people don't see that tells the story. When Miss Marple returned to the village, the drizzle had turned to soft rain. At the vicarage, Mrs. Bantry was waiting, bursting with the latest news. They say it wasn't robbery at all. The police found the colonel's desk key in his pocket. Nothing taken, nothing disturbed but that silly letter he was writing. Ah, said Miss Marple, removing her wet shawl. But he wasn't writing a letter, my dear. He was finishing one, and he never got the chance. Mrs. Bantry blinked. Whatever do you mean? Miss Marple poured herself a small cup of tea before answering. He was drafting his will, or a confession of some sort. To whom it may concern, that is not how one begins a friendly letter. It's the opening of something meant to be read after death. Good heavens, Mrs. Bantry breathed. Then he must have known. Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the window, where the mist was thickening again. Perhaps he suspected. The guilty often tell us who they are long before they act. We simply fail to listen. That evening, as the bells of St. Jude's tolled 9, Miss Marple walked once more toward the colonel's cottage. The police had finished their search. Only the constable on duty remained, stamping his feet against the cold. She greeted him kindly and slipped through the gate. The grass was darker now, wet and glistening. Her eyes, keen as a bird's, swept over the ground. There, beside the rose bush, the faint indentation of a heel, smaller than the colonel's boot, lighter, but not a woman's shoe. She crouched, studying the angle. Whoever it was had approached from the side path leading to the rectory, not the road. And nearby, half buried in mud, a scrap of thin paper clung to a twig. She lifted it carefully, smoothing the corner under her lantern. It was torn from the colonel's half-written letter, the ink smeared, but one word still legible. Blackmail. Miss Marple folded it gently, her face unreadable. She thanked the constable, wished him a pleasant night, and walked home beneath the quiet bells. Inside her cottage, she placed the torn paper beside the brass button on her mantel, 2 small pieces of a puzzle that was beginning to take shape. She sat for a long while, her fingers steepled, the rain whispering against the window. Then, at last, she murmured to herself, 3 bells before midnight, a watch stopped at 10 to 12, and a woman who heard footsteps in the fog. Yes, I think I see it now. But I'll wait for one more sound before I'm sure. Outside, St. Mary Mead slept uneasily, the church tower looming pale in the mist. When midnight came, the bells tolled thrice again. Soft, mournful, measured, and in the stillness that followed, Miss Marple's eyes opened. She knew at last whom the bells had been tolling for all along. The next morning, St. Mary Mead seemed to hum with restrained expectancy. The murder had settled into the rhythm of village life. Half fear, half fascination, and everyone felt entitled to a theory. The grocer claimed it was an affair of jealousy. The vicar thought it was political. The postmistress, more imaginative, whispered that it had something to do with a hidden treasure from the war. Miss Marple, however, sat at her breakfast table reading the local paper, which contained little more than speculation. She stirred her tea thoughtfully, her gaze distant. The torn scrap of the colonel's letter and the brass button lay beside her, as yet unspoken companions to her thoughts. She knew Inspector Slack would soon arrive. He always did when something puzzled him, though he disliked admitting it. Sure enough, a sharp knock came before the hour was out. Slack entered, brisk and damp from the drizzle, with an expression of irritated determination. "Miss Marple," he began without ceremony, "we've just received the autopsy report. The colonel was struck once. Clean blow, back of the skull. Heavy object, probably blunt iron. Time of death, around 11:45. Miss Marple nodded gently. So, just before the 3 bells. Slack frowned. You and your bells. I suppose you'll tell me they did it next. Oh no, she said mildly. Bells don't kill people, Inspector, but they do tell us when people lie about where they were. He raised an eyebrow. Meaning Miss Harcourt? Miss Marple's fingers traced the rim of her cup. She said she arrived after 11 and left because the lights were out. But the Colonel died just before 12, and the gate shows the marks of 2 visitors. The first, heavier, his own pace, returning from the house to fetch something. The second, lighter but firm, a man's step, not a lady's. Slack folded his arms. We found no footprints worth the name. Too much rain. Quite, Miss Marple said softly. Which makes the ones that remained rather special, wouldn't you say? Mud holds only what stays longest. Slack sighed. You've a way of making the obvious sound suspicious. Not suspicious, she corrected. Merely human. You see, I think the Colonel knew who his visitor would be. He expected him. The torn letter said blackmail, which suggests a prior conversation. The question is, who had both reason and opportunity to use that word? Slack rubbed his chin. We're looking into his finances. Bank statements, insurance, the usual. There's talk he was sending money, cash, to someone in London. No record who. Miss Marple's eyes brightened faintly. Oh, yes. Quiet payments. They often mean either guilt or pity. And pity can be rather dangerous when misread. The inspector frowned again. You think he was being blackmailed? I think, said Miss Marple. He believed he was. But there's a difference between real blackmail and the kind one invents to hide a shameful kindness. Slack looked doubtful, but before he could reply, a knock sounded at the door. It was Mrs. Bantry, breathless with gossip. They've found something, Jane, in the Colonel's tool shed. A walking stick, heavy as lead, with mud on the handle. Ah, Miss Marple said calmly. Then we are very near the end. She thanked the inspector for his visit and watched him hurry off toward the Colonel's cottage, Mrs. Bantry trotting beside him in delighted anxiety. When they were gone, Miss Marple remained still, eyes on the window pane, where raindrops slid in slow, deliberate trails. Something about the walking stick troubled her, not its existence, but its meaning. A man like the Colonel would never use another's cane. Too proud, yet someone had placed it there, carefully enough for it to be found. By mid-afternoon, the air had cleared, and the church bells struck 3. Miss Marple put on her hat and made her way down the lane to the Colonel's cottage once more. The constable at the gate looked exhausted and wary. They're saying it's solved now, miss. The gardener, Mr. Kellett. He's confessed. Has he indeed? Miss Marple murmured. And what has he confessed to, precisely? Said he came by to borrow tools, saw the Colonel in the garden. They quarrelled. Claimed he lost his temper. Very tidy, she said. Too tidy, perhaps. The constable blinked. Beg pardon? She smiled faintly. Confessions that fit so neatly are rarely true. They are like hats that fit everyone, made to please, not to protect. She asked quietly if she might look about the garden once more, and when permission was granted, she walked the length of the gravel path to the side shed. The ground was dry now, but faint traces of movement lingered. Small depressions, subtle scrapes. By the rose bush, where she had found the brass button, she now noticed a darker mark, a smudge on the stone border, as though something metallic had been set there briefly, not dropped. The shape was round, small, deliberate. She bent low, her gaze narrowing. A cufflink, perhaps, or the base of a watch. She thought of the Colonel's stopped clock, his meticulous nature, and the unfinished letter. Then, softly, she straightened, a glimmer of understanding passing through her eyes like dawn through fog. When she returned home, dusk was settling over the rooftops, and the smell of damp earth filled the air. She laid out the button, the scrap of letter, and a small pressed flower she had found near the gate, a faded violet carefully tied with a thread. Her lips curved slightly. It was not blackmail at all, but something older, sadder. At 7:30, Inspector Slack appeared again, frustrated. "You were right about Kellett. Turns out he couldn't have done it. Was delivering firewood over at Wensley Green. Alibis all round. Blast it." Miss Marple poured him tea, her voice mild. "Oh, I'm relieved. He's not the sort to strike in anger, only to mutter in discontent. I dare say you found the Colonel's walking stick most intriguing, though. Weighted end, clean fingerprints, his own. Could have hit himself, though that's unlikely." "Not at all," Miss Marple said softly. "But perhaps it was placed there later to confuse. Just as that poor man's clock was stopped to suggest a time that suited someone else. I think," she added gently, "you should look again at who arrived that night by car, and who might have left by foot." Slack stared at her, half annoyed, half curious. "You mean Miss Harcourt?" "I mean," Miss Marple said, folding her hands, "that some debts of the heart are paid long after their due, and one should never underestimate the length to which love, or pride, will go when faced with exposure." The rain began again, steady and soft against the glass. Slack rose, muttering that he would have her story checked. When the door closed, Miss Marple sat alone, listening to the distant bells. 3 chimes again, slow and solemn. She whispered into the stillness, "By the time they toll tomorrow, it will all be over." Her eyes moved once more to the mantel, where the small brass button glowed dully in the lamplight. It was engraved faintly with a crest, a military one, not the Colonel's regiment, but another. The pattern was clear now. The past had returned, and someone had tried, far too late, to silence it. Morning crept quietly over St. Mary Mead, pale light threading through thin mist. The village had grown restless. The Colonel's death had rippled beyond curiosity now into unease. Miss Marple noticed it in the way the milkman lingered by her gate, in the subdued chatter of the women at the post office. Fare, she knew, often hid itself behind ordinary errands. People pretended to discuss weather and ration cards, but listened, always, for the next piece of dreadful news. Inspector Slack arrived before breakfast, his expression a curious blend of frustration and reluctant respect. "You've set me chasing ghosts again, Miss Marple," he said, standing awkwardly by her hearth. "We traced that brass button you found. Belonged to a uniform of the 8th Fusilier, Colonel Harborough's old regiment, but here's the thing, it wasn't his. His insignia was different." Miss Marple poured his tea with her usual serenity. "So the button belonged to another man from the same regiment, someone he once knew, perhaps?" Slack nodded. "We made some inquiries. There's one fellow fits the bill. Major Leonard Fitch. Retired. Lives over in Much Haddam. Used to be close with the Colonel during the war, until some business went sour. Rumor says there was trouble over a lost consignment, accusations of theft. Both cleared, of course, but they hadn't spoken since." Miss Marple's eyes lifted thoughtfully. And yet a man's quarrels have a way of surviving far longer than his friendships. "Tell me, Inspector, did Major Fitch ever visit St. Mary Mead?" "Not that we've heard," Slack said, "but his niece, Miss Lydia Harcourt, has been seen here often enough. Visiting her aunt," she said. "Now, I don't suppose you think that's coincidence." "Coincidences," Miss Marple murmured, "are so very rare in murder." Slack gave a humorless laugh. "You've got that look again. Go on, then. What are you thinking?" "That Miss Harcourt is not quite the grieving woman she pretends to be," Miss Marple said gently. "Her visit the night of the murder was no act of reconciliation. It was, I think, a confrontation. Perhaps she discovered that her uncle's old quarrel had come to light again, something that touched her reputation or her purse. And then there is the matter of that letter, torn and left unfinished. You mean the blackmail bit? Precisely, Miss Marple said. A word like that is never chosen lightly. I fancy the Colonel intended to expose someone, but he hesitated because the truth might ruin more than one person. So he arranged a meeting, intending to put things in order. Instead, he was silenced. Slack frowned, rubbing his temple. If you're right, that puts Miss Harcourt and her uncle in the middle of it. But we've no proof she met anyone else that night. Not yet, Miss Marple said, her eyes flicking to the window. But the church bells told us the timing, the clock in the Colonel's study told us the lie, and that brass button tells us the visitor was no stranger. What remains, she added softly, is to see who benefits from the Colonel's death. By afternoon the clouds had lifted, leaving behind a dull silver sky. Miss Marple set out toward the Harborough cottage again. The police had gone for now, and the place stood quiet, the garden heavy with damp. She moved slowly along the path, pausing by the rose bush where the button had gleamed days before. Something new caught her eye, a faint impression in the soil, as if a tire had pressed briefly against the earth. A small car, light, not the Colonel's larger motor. She crouched, studying it. The tread was narrow, smooth-edged, precisely the sort used on Miss Harcourt's make of car. At that moment, a voice startled her. "Looking for something, Miss Marple?" Lydia Harcourt stood behind the gate, her face pale but composed. She wore black now, the kind of mourning that drew attention rather than concealed grief. "Oh, merely admiring the roses," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "The Colonel took great pride in them, though it seems they've suffered from the weather lately." Lydia's gaze sharpened. "You mean from the blood?" Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. "Death has a way of touching everything it passes, even flowers." The younger woman exhaled, a brittle sound. "You think I killed him? My dear, I think you loved him once, and hated what he reminded you of." Lydia's composure faltered for the briefest second. "He ruined my uncle's name," she said quietly. "Leonard was never guilty, but the scandal followed him for years, and Geoffrey Harborough did nothing to stop it. He let the whispers fester. Do you know what that does to a family? I imagine it leaves a wound that never quite heals," Miss Marple said softly. "And yet your uncle lived comfortably enough in Much Haddam, did he not?" Lydia's eyes flicked away. "He did. But debts linger, Miss Marple. Favours owed, promises broken. Geoffrey owed us more than words." Miss Marple's tone remained mild. "So he invited you that night, to make amends?" "Perhaps," Lydia murmured, "or to make excuses." "And when you arrived," Miss Marple continued gently, "you found someone else there, someone who had come before you. The quarrel had already begun." Lydia's eyes widened just slightly, the first hint of fear breaking through her poise. "Who told you that?" "No one," Miss Marple said. "But the ground did. There were 2 visitors that night, not one, and one of them wore a button from the 8th Fusiliers. You see, I don't believe your Uncle Leonard stayed away at all. He came to finish what had begun long ago." The silence between them thickened. Then quietly, Lydia said, "You're mistaken." Miss Marple smiled gently. "I do hope so, my dear, because if I'm not, then you've been protecting a murderer, and that is such a lonely sort of love." Lydia's chin trembled, but she said nothing more. She turned abruptly and walked toward her car, her hands trembling as she fumbled with the key. Miss Marple watched her drive away, the motor sputtering into the mist. When she returned home, the church bells were tolling 6. She sat by her fire, knitting forgotten in her lap, as the pattern of the truth took clearer shape in her mind. The Colonel had tried to right an old wrong. The wrong had come back to claim him. Tomorrow, she thought, the last piece would fall into place. The bell would toll again, but this time it would sound not for the dead, but for the living who had hidden among them. The following morning, mist clung low across the village green, blurring the outlines of the cottages and giving the air a feeling of watchful quiet. Miss Marple sat by her window, the morning paper unopened beside her teacup. Her thoughts were elsewhere, on the conversation with Lydia Harcourt, on the fear that had flashed unguarded in that proud woman's eyes. Fear, Miss Marple knew, was rarely about what one had done. It was about who might finally speak. Just as the clock struck 9, a knock sounded at her door. Inspector Slack entered, hat in hand, looking more unsettled than usual. "You were right again," he said without preamble. "We've checked on Major Leonard Fitch. The man left much Haddam the evening of the murder. Told his housekeeper he had business in town. Never arrived anywhere he said he would. Came back after midnight, mud on his coat, refused to say where he'd been." Miss Marple's brows rose slightly. "Ah, so he did come then." "Seems like it," Slack said grimly. "I've sent a man to fetch him in. If he did it, we'll have him before nightfall." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Be careful, Inspector. Men like Major Fitch rarely act without reason, and reason can be far more dangerous than temper." Slack gave her a skeptical look. "Motive's clear enough, isn't it? Revenge for what the Colonel did years back. Easy as pie." She shook her head faintly. "Revenge, yes. But not his own, I think. There's someone else's hand guiding his." Before Slack could ask what she meant, a shadow appeared at the gate. Lydia Harcourt stood there, pale and drawn, her gloved hands clutching her handbag. When she stepped inside, her composure was brittle, every movement deliberate, as though one wrong word might shatter her. "Miss Marple," she said quietly, "I've come to tell you something before it's too late. I can't bear it any longer." Slack stiffened. "You'd best sit down, Miss Harcourt. We were just about to send for your uncle." Her eyes flicked toward him briefly, then back to Miss Marple. "Yes, you'll find him. But he didn't kill Geoffrey." Her voice trembled but steadied again. "It was an accident. At least it began as one." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Tell us." Lydia's hands twisted the gloves in her lap. "I did go to the cottage that night, as I told you, but when I arrived, my uncle was already there. He had come ahead of me, furious that Geoffrey had written. I didn't even know he'd received a letter until I saw them arguing by the gate. I hid in the shadows. I didn't want Geoffrey to see me. They were shouting about that old business during the war, about a missing dispatch case. My uncle had always sworn Geoffrey planted the blame on him to protect someone else. Geoffrey told him it was time the truth came out, that he'd written to the regiment to confess." Slack frowned. "Confess to what?" "To perjury," Lydia whispered. He'd lied in the inquiry. It was another man, a friend of his, who had taken the money, and Geoffrey covered for him. But if that confession were made public now, it would destroy my uncle's name forever. The pension, the house, everything. Uncle Leonard begged him to stay silent. Geoffrey refused. Her breath hitched. Then there was a struggle. My uncle struck him. I think he didn't mean to. He was old, weak, but Geoffrey fell, hit his head on the stone path. It happened so fast. I ran to him. He was already gone." Slack's face had hardened. "So your uncle killed him, whether by accident or not. That's murder in my book." Lydia shook her head fiercely. "No, you don't understand. Geoffrey was already dying. He said so himself. He'd had attacks before. He meant to put things right before the end. My uncle only pushed fate a little faster." Miss Marple's eyes were calm, thoughtful. "And afterward, what did you do?" "I made my uncle leave," Lydia said quietly. "He was shaking, half out of his mind. I tried to make it look like a robbery. I thought if they believed a thief had done it, no one would ever know the truth. I stopped the clock so the time would fit. I took the key from the desk and scattered the papers. I thought I could carry his sin for him." Slack exhaled sharply, scribbling notes. "So you tampered with the scene. That'll be obstruction, at least." Miss Marple ignored him. "And the brass button?" Lydia looked up, startled. He must have dropped it. It was from his old uniform. He wore the coat that night. I begged him to burn it when he returned, but he couldn't. He kept it like a fool." There was silence for a moment. The faint sound of church bells drifted through the open window, 3 soft chimes marking the quarter hour. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on Lydia's face, not unkindly. "You see, my dear, the trouble with such secrets is that they rot from the inside out. You meant to protect him, but truth always rises, like air beneath water." Tears glimmered in Lydia's eyes. "He didn't mean to kill him, Miss Marple. He only wanted to stop him from ruining us both. He was proud, too proud to bear the shame." "I know," Miss Marple said softly. "Pride and fear are dreadful companions, but they rarely travel alone. Someone must carry their burden in the end." Just then, the door opened again. A constable entered, breathless. "Inspector, Major Fitch. He's in custody." He came quietly, asked only if the bells had struck noon yet. Slack pocketed his notebook, muttering something under his breath. Miss Marple rose slowly, her expression tinged with sadness. "Then he's already confessed to himself," she said. As they left, Lydia lingered by the doorway, her figure framed against the grey morning. "What will happen to him?" she asked. Miss Marple turned to her gently. "The law will do as it must, but the truth, well, the truth will be kinder than silence ever was." When they were gone, she sat by her window once more, the mist clearing to reveal the spire of St. Jude's. The bells tolled faintly again, steady as a heartbeat. She counted them, 1, 2, 3, and smiled sadly to herself. 3 bells before midnight, 3 before noon. Life, she thought, always gives warning before it takes. But people, being people, never hear until it is far too late. It was late afternoon when Inspector Slack returned to Miss Marple's cottage. The clouds had rolled back, leaving a dull golden light that touched the rooftops of St. Mary Mead. He looked unusually subdued as he stepped inside, hat in hand, boots still damp from the walk. "It's done," he said simply. "Fitch has confessed." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting, the motion of her needles never faltering. "Has he indeed? And how did he sound, Inspector?" Slack hesitated. "Tired," he admitted. "Said he'd been carrying the weight of that lie for 20 years. Said the colonel wanted to clear his conscience before he died, but he couldn't let it happen. Not after all the years of disgrace. Claimed he didn't mean to strike him. They struggled, and Harborough fell. Said it was God's will." Miss Marple gave a faint, almost sorrowful smile. "Ah, yes. Men often blame Providence when they can't face their own temper. And Miss Harcourt?" "She's left for London," Slack said. "Said she couldn't bear the sight of the village any longer. I can't say I blame her." He paused, shifting awkwardly. "You know, I should be satisfied. The man confessed. The evidence fits. But I can't help feeling, well, that something's missing." Miss Marple's eyes met his over the rim of her teacup. "It usually is, Inspector, when one confesses to half a truth." Slack frowned. "Half?" She set her knitting aside. "Major Fitch killed the colonel, yes, but that was not the whole of it. I dare say he meant to frighten him, perhaps even silence him. But if you've listened carefully to Mrs. Harcourt's account, there's a space between what she said and what she saw. And it's that space, Inspector, that contains the real story." He frowned deeper. "You think she lied?" "Not lied," Miss Marple said softly. "Only edited. You see, Lydia Harcourt wasn't merely a niece protecting her uncle. She was also protecting herself. She told us her uncle begged Geoffrey to stay silent, but it was she who had most to lose if the truth emerged. If the colonel's confession had been made public, it would not only have exposed Major Fitch's dishonor, but also revealed the quiet arrangement that had supported Lydia for years. The colonel's monthly payments, the ones you mentioned, those were to her, not to her uncle. Not out of guilt, but affection, a secret kindness, one he meant to make official before he died. Slack's jaw tightened. "Are you saying she had a motive too?" Miss Marple's voice was gentle but firm. "I'm saying that when she came upon them that night, her uncle and the colonel quarreling, she realized her entire future was about to collapse. Perhaps she meant to stop them. Perhaps she only meant to intervene. But when her uncle's blow sent Geoffrey to the ground, she saw the opportunity to preserve everything. She made sure her uncle believed it was accidental, then shaped the scene to look like a robbery, ensuring suspicion would never fall on them. In doing so, she condemned him and freed herself." Slack stared at her, struggling between disbelief and reluctant admiration. "That's a cold thought, Miss Marple." "Coldness is often mistaken for strength, Inspector," she replied quietly, "especially in those who've had to survive on pride." He rubbed the back of his neck. "So you think she let him confess, knowing he'd hang for it?" Miss Marple shook her head. "No. She knew he wouldn't hang. A confession from an old, frail man who claims accident. Well, the law has its mercies. He'll be gone before the trial ends, and she will live quietly somewhere new, her name intact. I dare say she believes she's done her duty to him. Such people often do." Slack let out a long breath, sinking into the chair opposite her. "It's a dreadful business. You'd think in a place as small as this, people wouldn't have the room for so much deceit." "Oh, my dear Inspector," Miss Marple said with a faint twinkle of sadness. "Deceit needs very little room. A single heart will do." He looked at her for a long moment, then stood. "You're right again, of course. But there's no proof, nothing solid we can act on." "There rarely is," she murmured. "Some truths must live in silence, and some are punished not by courts, but by the memory of what they've done." When he had gone, Miss Marple remained seated, her knitting untouched. The light outside had turned softer, fading toward dusk. She rose and crossed to the mantel where the small, brass button still lay beside the scrap of torn paper. She picked them up, turning them in her palm. "Blackmail," she whispered, reading the faint word again. But it was never money he feared. It was forgiveness. As evening settled over the village, she stepped out into her garden. The air was cool, laced with the scent of wet earth and roses. From the church tower, the bells began to toll. Slow, solemn, 3 chimes once more. Miss Marple listened, her face calm and reflective. The pattern had ended where it began. 3 bells before midnight, 3 before confession, 3 before peace. The next morning, a letter arrived from Inspector Slack, brief, formal, but edged with a note of reluctant respect. "Case closed," it read. "Major Fitch deceased during the night. Heart failure, most likely. Miss Harcourt not expected to return." Miss Marple folded the letter neatly and placed it in the drawer with the button and the paper. Then, standing by her window, she watched the mist lift from the churchyard, revealing the headstones glistening in the pale sun. "Poor soul," she murmured. "So much pride, so little mercy." And then, with that same quiet composure that had carried her through 100 small tragedies, she turned back to her tea and her knitting, while the bells of St. Jude's struck the hour once more, steady, certain, and untroubled by the secrets they had told for. The following days passed with a quiet that felt uneasy, as though the air itself were holding its breath. The newspapers had printed the story of Colonel Harborough's death and the tragic confession of Major Fitch, whose sudden passing in custody lent the case a grim finality. St. Mary Mead, for all its appetite for scandal, had begun to move on, at least outwardly. The ladies at the grocer's returned to their talk of the church fete, and even Mrs. Bantry declared that some matters were better left in the hands of Providence. Yet beneath that calm surface, Miss Marple felt the faint pulse of something unresolved, something unfinished. It was nearly a week later when confirmation came in the most curious form. A small envelope, postmarked London, addressed to her in a firm, old-fashioned hand. Inside was a folded note and, pressed within it, another violet. Dried, brittle, the petals pale as dust. She read the note twice, then a third time, her brow furrowing ever so slightly. Miss Marple, you were right about most things, but wrong about one. I did not mean to hurt him, nor to protect myself. I meant only to keep a promise that should never have been made. You will understand when you hear the bells. They will ring again before midnight. There was no signature, but the handwriting was unmistakably Lydia Harcourt's. Miss Marple set the letter down beside her teacup. Outside, the sky was low and bruised, the kind of evening that seemed to dim before its time. She glanced toward the mantelpiece where the brass button and torn scrap of paper still lay, relics of a story that refused to rest. Something in that note struck her as both confession and warning. Lydia had left St. Mary Mead for London, or so the inspector said, but Miss Marple suspected that London had not held her for long. By 9 o'clock, the wind had risen, scattering dry leaves across the lane. The church bells, muffled by distance, sounded the hour. Miss Marple drew her shawl tighter and crossed to the window. Beyond the hedge, she thought she glimpsed movement near the vicarage path, a figure pausing, as if uncertain. She waited, breath still, until the figure stepped briefly into the light from a street lamp. It was a woman, slender, dressed in black. Lydia. Miss Marple opened her door before the knock came. Lydia stood there, pale, her eyes hollow yet fierce. "You knew I'd come," she said. "I rather thought so," Miss Marple replied. "You wrote to me." Lydia's lips trembled. "I had to. It's not over. You think you know what happened that night, but you don't. I've tried to forget it, but the bells won't stop ringing in my head." Miss Marple gestured gently toward the sitting room. "Come in, my dear. Tell me what truly troubles you." For a long moment, Lydia didn't move. Rain had begun to fall, fine and cold, drumming softly on the garden path. Then she stepped inside. "It wasn't my uncle who struck him," she said, her voice low and unsteady. "He did raise his hand, yes. But Geoffrey turned away before the blow landed. He stumbled, caught his foot on the lantern stand, and fell. I thought he was dead, but he wasn't. He tried to speak, to tell me something. I knelt beside him. He looked at me as though he could see straight through me. And then he whispered, 'The bells will stop when the truth is told.'" Miss Marple's gaze softened. "And the truth, Miss Harcourt?" Lydia pressed her hands to her temples. "I didn't understand then, but now I think he meant that he wasn't dying of my uncle's anger or of his fall. He was dying because of something else, something already in him. He'd known for weeks, his heart. He told the doctor once, I remember." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Yes, I wondered if that were so." Tears spilled down Lydia's cheeks. "He died thinking of forgiveness, and I let my uncle believe he had killed him. I let him carry that guilt because I was too afraid to lose everything, the money, the house, the safety it gave me. And now he's dead too, and I've nothing left but the bells." Miss Marple rose quietly and poured her guest a small cup of tea. "You see, my dear, guilt takes many forms. Sometimes it kills, and sometimes it follows, quietly, until one can no longer bear its company. But confession has a way of loosening its grip." Lydia shook her head. "Confession can't undo what I did. I stood there and watched him die. And when the bells struck midnight, I swore I'd never hear them again. But they rang this evening, Miss Marple. 3 times like that night. I think it's a sign. I can't live with it." Miss Marple reached across the table, her touch steady. "It isn't a sign, child. It's memory, dressed in sound. The bells have always tolled for the living more than the dead. They remind us to make peace while we still can." Lydia's gaze lifted slowly. Then what should I do? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Go to the church. Tell the vicar what you've told me. The truth won't bring back the dead, but it will quiet the bells in your mind. You see, my dear, St. Jude's has a way of holding its forgiveness close, but it never refuses it. For a long moment, Lydia sat silent, then nodded once. She rose, her shadow long in the lamplight. Will you come with me? She asked. Miss Marple hesitated, then took her shawl. Yes, my dear. I think I should. The rain had stopped when they stepped outside. The road gleamed faintly under the gas lights, and the sound of the wind had fallen away. In the distance, the church tower loomed, its bells still. As they reached the gate, Lydia paused, clutching the violet in her hand. Do you hear it? She whispered. Miss Marple listened. The village lay silent. Only the faint rustle of trees and the steady tick of her pocket watch filled the air. No, my dear, she said gently. The bells have finished their tolling. It's time you did too. And as they walked together toward the quiet church, the clock in St. Mary Mead struck 12, once softly, as if in benediction. The rain began again before they reached the church. A fine mist, more like breath than water, hung over the gravestones and blurred the lamps along the path. Lydia walked quickly, her shoulders drawn in, the violet still clasped in her gloved hand. Miss Marple followed at her own careful pace, her steps steady on the wet cobblestones. The air smelled faintly of damp stone and old roses, the kind that grew wild along the churchyard wall. Inside, St. Jude's was dim, its nave lit by only 2 flickering candles. The vicar, a gentle man with tired eyes, looked up in surprise as the 2 women entered. Lydia stopped just short of the aisle, her breath trembling. I need to tell you something, she said softly, her voice echoing faintly in the stillness. About Colonel Harborough, about that night. The vicar rose from his pew, nodding slowly. Of course, my child. Come and sit. Miss Marple watched from near the door as Lydia spoke in hushed tones. She couldn't hear the words, only the rhythm of them, halting at first, then steadier, like a confession breaking through ice. The vicar said nothing for a long time. When he did speak, his tone was calm, almost sorrowful. You've carried this too long, he murmured. It's time to let it go. But even as he spoke, the faint sound of bells drifted through the air. Not the soft, regular toll from the tower, but a single, discordant note, metallic and distant, as if struck by accident. The vicar looked up, startled. Odd, he said. The clock's not due for another quarter hour. Lydia's face went pale. It's him, she whispered. It's the Colonel. Miss Marple crossed the aisle and laid a steadying hand on her arm. No, my dear, bells cannot haunt. They simply ring when they are called. But her eyes flickered toward the tower, where a faint tremor ran through the beams as if the great bell itself had shifted. The vicar took a lantern and led them into the belfry, to be certain nothing was amiss. The stairs creaked beneath their weight, the air growing colder as they climbed. At the top, the smell of rust and old rope filled the space. The bell rope swung slightly in the draught, its end damp and frayed. The vicar frowned. Strange. No wind tonight strong enough to move it. Miss Marple's gaze drifted downward, to a narrow window that looked onto the churchyard. Below, the faint glow of a lantern bobbed between the graves. Someone walking there, though it was near midnight. She peered closer. There's someone outside, she said quietly. They descended quickly. By the time they reached the door, the figure was gone, the lantern's light extinguished. Only the faint impression of footprints led toward the far gate, where the road curved back to the old vicarage lane. Lydia clutched at Miss Marple's sleeve. He's following me. I know it. No, Miss Marple said gently. But someone is. Someone who knows what you've done, and what you haven't. The vicar looked bewildered. Surely you don't mean... Miss Marple's eyes were sharp now, her voice low. "The Colonel's solicitor, Mr. Penfold, was seen here yesterday morning." He was making inquiries quietly. The Colonel had written to him days before his death, leaving instructions for a sealed envelope to be delivered to the authorities only if he died unnaturally. That envelope was never found in his desk. "I suspect, Lydia, that you, or your uncle, removed it." Lydia's lips parted, but no sound came. Miss Marple continued, her tone steady. "Someone else must have known of it. Perhaps the person who came tonight, searching the churchyard. You see, the Colonel's letter was never about blackmail at all. It was an act of protection for you. He had planned to confess everything about your uncle's misdeed in order to clear your family name entirely. That was why he summoned you, to explain. But when he fell, that truth died with him, and now someone else wants what he left behind." The vicar looked between them, confused. "Then who?" "Someone close enough to the Colonel to know his habits," Miss Marple said. "Someone who would benefit from his silence. His manservant, perhaps, the one who claimed to be away that night visiting his sister. He had access to the Colonel's papers, his keys, even the post." Lydia's hand flew to her mouth. "Mr. Briggs? But he was so loyal." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Loyalty, my dear, is a fine thing until it meets temptation. The Colonel trusted him with more than wages. He trusted him with money intended for you. When Briggs learned of the confession, he realized exposure meant the end of his comfort. He waited until after your uncle's visit, then went to the cottage to retrieve the letter, and found death instead. A simple opportunity, too easy to resist. He took what he wanted, staged what little he could, and disappeared before dawn." The vicar shook his head. "Then he's the one who came tonight?" "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. To be sure, the past was buried as thoroughly as the Colonel himself. A gust of wind blew through the churchyard gate, carrying with it the faint echo of boots on gravel. Miss Marple turned toward the sound. "He's still here." The vicar raised his lantern. The light swept across the graves and caught a flash of movement near the yew trees. For an instant, a face appeared, thin, ghostly pale, the face of the Colonel's former manservant. Then he turned and ran toward the lane. Lydia gave a cry, but Miss Marple held her back. "Let him go. The inspector will find him soon enough. Men like that cannot run far from what they've done." They stood in silence, listening as the footsteps faded into the rain. The bells above them began to toll once more, slow and deliberate. 3 strokes that rolled across the village and vanished into the dark. Lydia's shoulders eased at last, as though some invisible weight had been lifted. Miss Marple looked up toward the tower. "There," she said softly. "The bells are no longer for the dead. They're for the living, and for the truth that was finally spoken." Lydia turned to her, eyes red but calmer now. "How do you always know, Miss Marple?" She smiled faintly. "Because people, my dear, are far more predictable than they think. Bells and hearts, they both ring out in the end when something within them breaks." And together, under the hush of the midnight chimes, they walked back toward the village, the mist folding around them like forgiveness long overdue. The next morning broke with pale sunlight spilling through mist, glinting off puddles that still trembled from the night's rain. St. Mary Mead looked washed clean, though the stillness that followed such storms always carried a certain unease, like a pause between heartbeats. Miss Marple sat in her garden with her teacup cooling beside her, the newspaper folded unread. Her thoughts lingered on the image of the manservant disappearing into the night, the echoes of the church bells fading behind him. She had known it would not be over so neatly. The human heart seldom allowed such convenient endings. And sure enough, as the clock struck 8, Inspector Slack came trudging up her path, his boots leaving dark prints on the wet flagstones. He looked both triumphant and troubled, a combination Miss Marple recognized as the hallmark of an incomplete victory. "Caught him," he said as she opened the door. "Briggs, Found him hiding in a shed on the edge of the downs. Had the Colonel's missing envelope with him, partly burned, but enough left to see what it was. Miss Marple motioned for him to sit. Ah, so the last page of the story has been found. And what did the letter say? Slack hesitated, pulling out a small folded document wrapped in oilcloth. It was the Colonel's confession, just as you said. He took the blame for that old army theft to protect a man under his command. But it wasn't Fitch. It was Briggs himself. He'd been the Colonel's orderly back then, used the war to hide his own thefts. The Colonel covered for him to save his career. Seems Briggs couldn't live with the debt, or the fear that the truth would finally surface. Miss Marple's expression softened, though her eyes darkened with thought. So he silenced the very man who had saved him. How dreadfully common that is, Inspector. Gratitude has such a short memory when guilt takes its place. Slack nodded grimly. He admitted it, said he'd gone to the cottage that night after Fitch and Miss Harcourt left. Meant to take the confession and destroy it. The Colonel woke, saw him, tried to stop him. There was a struggle. Harborough's heart gave out before Briggs even realized what he'd done. Heart, Miss Marple repeated softly. Yes, I thought as much. Slack sighed. Briggs says he panicked. Tried to make it look like a robbery. He even planted a few things near the hedge. Then he ran. When Fitch confessed, he thought the danger had passed. Only when Miss Harcourt returned did he realize you'd been asking too many questions. Miss Marple smiled faintly. I imagine I've been accused of that before. He shook his head, weary but impressed. It's all in hand now. We'll take Briggs to London for trial. Not that it'll last long. His health's worse than Fitch's ever was. I suppose it's all settled at last. Miss Marple looked out the window toward the church tower. Settled? Perhaps. But never tidy, Inspector. Not where hearts are concerned. Slack frowned. You think there's more? She turned her teacup slowly in her hands. Only that truth rarely belongs to one person. The Colonel, the Major, Miss Harcourt, Briggs. They all shared a part of it, though none saw the whole. It took death to draw the lines together. He gave a rueful smile. You make it sound almost poetic, Miss Marple. I just call it a mess. Ah, she said gently. It is the same thing, really. Later that afternoon, the village returned to its familiar rhythm, the milk cart rattling along the lane, children running near the green, the faint hum of gossip shifting to other, small excitements. But at the church, the air still held something solemn. Miss Marple attended the quiet service for the Colonel and the Major, sitting in her usual place near the back. Lydia Harcourt was there too, in a simple black dress, her face pale but composed. When the hymns ended and the villagers drifted away, Lydia approached her. They say he confessed everything, she said softly, that the Colonel was trying to save him even then. Miss Marple inclined her head. He was a man of order and loyalty. Those qualities, when misplaced, can cause as much harm as good. Lydia hesitated. Do you think I'll ever be free of it? The bells, I mean. Miss Marple's eyes warmed. You already are. They rang last night not for guilt, but for release. The sound you heard was truth finding its rest. You must let it rest too. For the first time in days, Lydia smiled. It was faint, uncertain, but real. You make it sound easy. Not easy, Miss Marple said, but simple. They walked together toward the gate, pausing by the rose bush that lined the path. The rain had washed its leaves clean, and among them bloomed a single violet flower, bright against the green. Lydia stared at it, her voice catching. It looks just like the ones he planted. Yes, Miss Marple murmured. Things have a way of returning when they're meant to. That evening, as the sun sank beyond the thatched rooftops, Miss Marple sat by her fire, knitting laid aside. Outside, the last toll of the church bells drifted through the air. 3 soft chimes, unhurried, serene. She listened with a faint smile, counting them under her breath. 3 for the past, she thought. 3 for the truth, and 3 for peace. When the final note faded, she rose, closed her window, and turned down the lamp. The world of St. Mary Mead was quiet once more, its secrets folded neatly beneath the surface, as they always were, until the next sound, the next whisper, the next quiet crack in the veneer of village life. For now, all was still. And in that stillness, the bells of St. Jude's rested at last. The following week brought a rare calm to St. Mary Mead. The village, so often quick to stir itself into excitement, seemed to exhale collectively, as though relieved to have its peace returned. The papers had printed the outcome of the inquiry. Major Fitch's death ruled as natural causes, Briggs charged but unlikely to stand trial due to his failing condition. The matter, to most minds, was finished. Yet Miss Marple knew that closure, like truth, seldom arrived cleanly tied with a ribbon. It lingered instead in small details, in half-forgotten gestures, in what people chose not to say. On the morning of the 7th day, she found herself walking toward the church once more. It was not deliberate, merely the sort of walk one takes when the air is fine and one's thoughts need quiet space to drift. But as she passed through the lych gate, she noticed the vicar kneeling near the flower beds by the vestry, his expression thoughtful. He straightened when he saw her. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, brushing the soil from his hands. "You've heard, I suppose? They buried Briggs last night. Quietly, at his request. No service, just a prayer." She nodded. "Yes, I thought it best that way. There's no use in ceremony when the soul is already judged by its own conscience." The vicar gave a faint smile. "You've a kinder theology than I do." "Only a more practical one," she replied. "Sin and sorrow are rather alike, Reverend. They grow best when left untended." He chuckled softly but grew serious again. "Still, there's something that troubles me. The church bell, one of the smaller ones, has cracked. We discovered it this morning. Odd thing. It's not been used heavily, and yet it's split clean down the center." Miss Marple's eyes lifted toward the tower, where the pale morning light glinted on the lead roof. "Cracked," she murmured. "Then perhaps the village will have its silence at last." The vicar looked puzzled. "You make it sound deliberate." "Perhaps not deliberate," she said gently, "but fitting." She lingered after he left, gazing up at the tower. The sound of the cracked bell, she imagined it, must have been strained and mournful, one final echo breaking apart before rest. It seemed somehow right, but as she turned to go, she noticed a figure standing near the colonel's grave, a man in a dark coat, tall, with his hat in hand. His back was to her, his posture solemn. For a moment she thought it might be a mourner from the Fitch family, but as he turned, she recognized the face. It was Mr. Penfold, the colonel's solicitor. He inclined his head when he saw her. "Miss Marple, forgive me. I didn't expect company this early." "Nor I," she said kindly. "You've come to pay your respects." "In a way," he said. "The colonel left certain private instructions I've only now completed. It's taken time to settle the accounts." She studied him quietly. "Ah, then Miss Harcourt will be provided for?" He hesitated, then gave a small nod. "Yes, though not in the way she might have expected." The colonel had transferred most of his estate into a trust, funds intended for a charitable foundation to aid widows of servicemen. Miss Harcourt is listed only as custodian of that trust. She cannot use a penny for herself. Miss Marple's lips curved in the faintest smile. How very like him. He has ensured she'll spend her days serving what she once feared. Penfold regarded her curiously. "You knew him well, then?" "Not well," she said softly, "but long enough to know he believed penance to be best lived, not spoken." The solicitor nodded thoughtfully, then added, "There's one other matter, something rather odd. A small box arrived this morning, addressed to you, from the Colonel's solicitor's office in London. It was delayed, apparently, posted before his death. I brought it along." He handed her a small parcel wrapped in brown paper and tied neatly with twine. Miss Marple accepted it with quiet composure, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of curiosity. "Thank you, Mr. Penfold. I dare say it will explain itself." When he had gone, she walked home slowly, the parcel tucked under her arm. She placed it on her table, untied the twine, and lifted the lid. Inside was a folded sheet of paper, yellowed at the edges, and beneath it a small silver pocket watch. Its face cracked, its hands frozen at 10 minutes to 12. She unfolded the letter, recognizing the Colonel's handwriting at once. "My dear Miss Marple, if you are reading this, then my affairs have reached their conclusion, though not, I suspect, without complication. I write to you because I have seen in you something I find rare. Clarity without judgment. You will, I think, understand what others might misread. I have long carried the burden of a lie, one meant to protect another man, but which has instead harmed all who touched it. I do not expect absolution, only that the truth be known to one capable of holding it without bitterness. When the bells of St. Jude's strike 3 before midnight, they will ring not for my death, but for release, from deceit, from pride, from silence. Should my heart fail me before that hour, know that I go not in fear, but in peace. Yours in friendship, Geoffrey Harborough." Miss Marple sat for a long time, the letter resting in her lap, the faint ticking of her mantel clock the only sound in the room. 10 minutes to 12, the moment his own watch had stopped. She turned the cracked timepiece in her hand, its weight oddly comforting, its silence absolute. When evening fell, she placed it on the mantel beside the brass button and the torn scrap of paper. 3 relics of a story that had begun with death and ended somehow with understanding. Outside, the wind stirred softly in the trees, and for the first time in many nights, the bells of St. Jude's remained silent. Miss Marple smiled faintly, the kind of smile that comes when one recognizes that a mystery, at last, has no more to hide. She drew the curtains, banked the fire, and whispered into the quiet room, "Rest well, Colonel. The bells have done their duty." And as the clock in her cottage struck the hour, steady, peaceful, unbroken, St. Mary Mead settled once again into its gentle, watchful calm, where secrets slept beneath the surface of ordinary life, waiting only for the next quiet hand to lift the veil. The afternoon sun fell low over St. Mary Mead, turning the cottage windows to squares of gold. It was the sort of peaceful day that made the village seem untouched by the tragedies it had so recently whispered about. Yet peace, Miss Marple knew, was never the absence of wrongdoing. It was simply what followed when the higher truth had been brought into the light. She sat by her window, sewing in quiet rhythm, the silver pocket watch resting on the table beside her. Its hands still marked 10 minutes to 12, a frozen memorial to the moment all the hidden hearts of the affair had stopped pretending. A knock came at the door. Inspector Slack entered, hat in hand, his tone less official than usual. "Afternoon, Miss Marple. I've come to thank you, though I don't expect I'll ever like the way you make me feel I've missed something obvious." She smiled mildly. "We all miss what we're not looking for, Inspector. You were searching for guilt. I was listening for conscience." Slack chuckled. "That's just like you to put it that way. Still, the Yard's quite pleased. Briggs won't live to see trial, but his confession clears Fitch's name. The papers will print it next week. Lydia Harcourt's already left the country. Seems she's taken the Colonel's charitable post in France." "How fitting," Miss Marple murmured. "Exile disguised as duty, but perhaps she'll find peace among those she must help." Slack looked curious. "You really think she didn't know the full story, that she wasn't part of it?" Miss Marple's eyes softened. "She knew enough to suffer by it, which is punishment enough. The Colonel's death gave her what the law never could, understanding. Some people only learn through loss, Inspector. It's the gentlest teacher life has." He grunted, half in agreement, half in bewilderment. "You've a way of making even murder sound like a sermon." "Not a sermon," she said quietly. "Only observation. One sees so much living in a small place like this. Pride masquerading as love, guilt mistaken for loyalty. It's all the same pattern, really. The colonel, the major, Lydia, Briggs. They each thought they were protecting someone else. In truth, they were all protecting themselves from shame." Slack regarded her for a moment, then said with reluctant admiration, "You always bring it back to people. That's what gets me. I keep thinking of evidence, and you think of hearts." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Because evidence, Inspector, tells us what happened, but only hearts tell us why. And it's the why that makes all the difference." He stood, glancing around her tidy sitting room, the lace curtains, the soft ticking of the mantel clock, the faint scent of lavender and tea. "You know," he said almost wistfully, "if more of us thought like you, the world might be a quieter place." "I doubt that," she said gently. "The world would still make its noise. But perhaps we'd hear it more clearly." He nodded, tipping his hat. "Good day to you, Miss Marple. I expect this'll be the last I hear of the Harborough case." "Oh, I shouldn't be too sure," she said, eyes twinkling. Stories have a habit of lingering where they're most inconvenient. When he was gone, Miss Marple returned to her chair. The air outside had grown still, heavy with that peculiar silence that comes just before the bells of St. Jude's began their hour. She listened as they tolled 4 times, clear even, untroubled. The cracked bell had been repaired, the vicar had told her that morning. The tone was lighter now, purer. Her gaze drifted to the mantel, where 3 small objects rested in a line: the brass button, the torn scrap of paper, and the stopped watch. The relics of deceit, of pride, of final truth. She had thought to pack them away, but somehow she couldn't. They felt like reminders, not of crime, but of the human weakness that made crime possible. The sort of reminders one should never entirely forget. She picked up the pocket watch and turned it over in her hand. The engraving on the back caught the light. Semper Fidelis, always faithful. It struck her then that the colonel had lived by that creed even when it destroyed him. His loyalty had cost him his peace, but in the end, it had restored the peace of others. Such was the quiet arithmetic of human decency. The sound of footsteps on the path broke her reverie. It was young Constable Reeves, red-cheeked and earnest as ever. "Begging your pardon, Miss Marple," he said, doffing his cap, "but the vicar sent me to tell you the church clock's been repaired proper. He says it'll strike at midnight again for the first time in weeks." "Will it indeed?" she said softly. "How very appropriate." "Yes, ma'am. The vicar said it felt wrong for the bells not to keep their hours. Said the village needs them to mark the time." Miss Marple smiled. "Yes, Reeves. Time must always be marked. Otherwise, we forget how precious it is." The young man nodded, not entirely understanding, and left her to her thoughts. That night, as the village settled into sleep, Miss Marple sat by her window watching the moon rise above the tower of St. Jude's. The repaired bell struck the hour. Steady, beautiful, a sound both ending and beginning. She listened until the last note faded into the night, then closed her eyes, content. For the first time since the colonel's death, there were no echoes, no shadows, no unspoken questions. The bells of St. Jude's had kept their promise. The truth had rung out, quiet but sure. And in the small lamplit cottage at the edge of the green, Miss Marple, with her knitting resting gently on her lap, whispered to no one in particular, "It's all quite solved now." The clock ticked on. The night deepened, and the village of St. Mary Mead, wrapped once more in its tender illusion of peace, slept beneath the steady, forgiving toll of its bells. The end.